The HR and OB leadership planning process, chapter 2, is where we start our discussion today. And so, one of the questions that should be posed is why leadership planning? Well, it's because it's tied to personal development, training, skill development, motivation, and changing behavior, all for a positive outcome and for the organization. Also, when you look at it, you have the element to help people personally. There are municipalities that can benefit from having leadership planning, project management, group dynamics, all benefit. And then strategy while you're developing it, tactics while you're executing. So, really, from an HR and OB standpoint, leadership planning falls right in line with the elements of how we influence and change behavior in a positive way. So the planning process for HR and OB has some components. The scan or survey element is one of those. How to establish and set goals is another. How do we put together strategy, and then how do we use the internet to assist us in this movement and building of the plan itself. So the leadership planning process really works within a structure. Scans usually should cover the social aspect, technological, economic, competitive, and legal aspect of what we're doing in order to assist us in the planning process. Goals themselves needed to be clear, sustainable, and achievable is extremely important. When we're developing strategy, we're looking to position ourselves. We're also looking to communicate and deliver in a multitude of modalities. And then last but not least, the internet, giving us that competitive advantage when we're looking at value creation and differentiation and the ability to facilitate and integrate through e-commerce and e-business. So the scan, and look at it this way: HROB is about changing behavior in individuals and groups. The scan has this tremendous significance in being able to do that because we're looking at these five key elements in order to help frame how we're going to be in a leadership role during the planning or the development of our plan. Goals have an intrapersonal and interpersonal element that's important not only in the planning process but also for HR and OB. So that clarity, that sustainability, that achievability is extremely important throughout the entire process and the operation and the marketplace in helping develop who we are as an organization. Strategy is critical because when we're trying to motivate people, we want them to follow the leaders of this particular initiative. So if you have a leadership plan that you're pulling together, it becomes obvious as to why strategy has to have so much significance. Well, positioning, the communication of what we're doing, the delivery of it means that our outreach to those individuals that are involved or touched by it is going to be critical to our success. And then the internet. The internet's role in planning is crucial because now we're looking at the ability to be able to quickly communicate and reach an audience. So the competitive advantage is actually based upon speed and accuracy, and then span as to how many people we can effectively touch. And so when we get into that discussion about the internet, we're looking for that competitive advantage from a value creation standpoint to differentiate ourselves. And when we're going through the planning process, we're thinking about the relationship between e-commerce and e-business. It's one of facilitation and integration at the same time. So one way to take a look at this is to really think in terms of the competitive advantage that we are trying to establish out there with our core competencies. And one of the ways to do that is to be able to create value in a way that differentiates us on a regular basis. If we are successful there, not only will we be unique, but we'll also be able to sustain ourselves over the long run. Keep as long as we keep our fluidity in what we're doing. So you can see that the internet is not this a static element that we're able to take advantage of in our leadership planning process. It becomes, or it should become, very fluid in how we do that. So how do we look at the internet a little bit more? On the left-hand side of this particular slide, we talk about e-commerce. So e-commerce can be portrayed to some degree as sort of the front face of your web presence. And today you have more than a single web presence. You don't just have a web page. You could have Facebook, you could Twitter, you can use email in creative ways. So it's the web presence that's important. And so the face of your web presence, or the front end of that business, should look as if it's putting the controls of the operation and the opportunity in the hands of the consumer. Whereas e-business is more the back end, the security, the ability to make sure those controls and the structure that you put in place executes in the fashion that you want it to execute. So immediately you should have a picture of why this is so significant in the planning process. And that process is a function of looking at formulation, adaptation, concentration, implementation, and evaluation. We're trying to ask ourselves questions about how successful we can be in pulling together the structure for our HR and OB plan. How do we categorize our leadership? How do we apply the goals? How do we fund our project? What changes do we need to make? So you can probably get a little bit of a visual that the planning process going through these stages needs to have a certain amount of detail and attention from the human relations and OB folks in order to make sure that that process gets its due diligence and ultimately has the opportunity to sustain itself in the long run. So here's an exercise, and it is optional, but here's an exercise to think about from a leadership planning standpoint. An individual exercise. Formulate an idea for a leadership plan. So you need to do a little bit of research in order to do that. And adapt the ideas to incorporate the 5 environmental scan components that we talked about in the beginning of this chapter. Concentrate more on developing goals and strategy. That's the key emphasis here after your research. And then put together the steps you think are necessary to implement your plan. So it should be about a 1 to 2 page summarized document, double space, a Word document if you decide to do the exercise. But I think it'll help you in 2 areas. One, it'll give you some type of thought process as to whether or not you're on the right track for the leadership planning process. And number 2, when you ultimately at the end of the course develop a leadership plan, it should help you there as well. Here's some definitions that might be helpful for you that we've kind of gone through today. Understanding SCAN and how it works, the development of goals and how they operate within the planning process, how we pull together our strategy and why that's important. And then last but not least, looking at the internet and why it is so significant in the HR and OB planning process for leadership. So what did we learn today? Well, we pulled together a lot of different elements. We want to try to understand how these 4 elements help us comprise the leadership planning process for HR and OB. Why is a SCAN important in development of our plan? How do goals help us not only stay on track, but keep us in a sustained frame of mind when we're looking at pulling together the planning process? How does strategy work with our SWOT analysis? And then how do we include the internet into our planning? Here is your thought for the day. The pessimist sees difficulty in every opportunity.